Hey, Father Michael here. So, yesterday, after I posted the little video that I made, um, I just happened to see what it looked like, and I don't know what I was doing yesterday. There is some man cleavage up in that video, so I'm I'm more tightly zipped up today. I was completely oblivious. Maybe I hadn't had enough coffee yesterday. Anyway, my apologies to those of you who were scandalized. So, what I'm thinking about today is the church where I grew up, St. Mary's in Oshkosh. And it's a big, beautiful Gothic German church. Those Germans know how to build stuff. And when my father passed away um, in 2016, just a few days after Christmas, I went home for the funeral, which of course was going to be in the family church. Now it's not called St. Mary's anymore. It's got some other stupid name because, I don't know, the Roman diocese has this harebrained scheme. If they mix up the names of the historic churches and they call them something else, then they can close them easier on a whim later and no one will realize. I don't know. It's some tomfoolery peculiar to the Roman way of handling things. Anyway, the church was in fact going to be closed 10 years earlier. But then a miracle occurred and someone left a $3 million bequest to structurally repair things and restore and all of that. But the money wasn't going to go to the diocese unless it went for that specific purpose. So, money talks and everything else walks. So, anyway, the good news is this amazingly beautiful historic church is still operational. So, going there for my father's funeral would be the first time that I would see the renovated church and all of that. And there were some disappointing things, They covered up the old asbestos linoleum floors, which were spectacular and carved and multicolored and all of that. And they also moved the organ console down to the first floor in the middle of the nave, which is far from where the cantor sings, and it has completely messed up the acoustics of the organ. The organ used to fill that space when it was up in the loft. Now, it sounds too small. So, anyway, that was a disappointment. Anyway, I got to the church quite a few hours in advance because that's where the visitation was also going to be held. And I didn't want to just stand around, the casket endlessly. So I'm exploring the church upstairs and downstairs. It was a basement church as well. And it's the church where I grew up. It's the church where I, since I was a toddler, it's where I first served Mass, where I learned to sing, where I learned how to read the neumes, as they're called, those little square weird notes in Gregorian chant. It's where I first heard the voice of God speak to me as a young boy. Well, like I said, that organ used to be located up in the choir loft because acoustically that makes sense. But it's not there anymore. And I remembered as I'm wandering around the church, taking everything in, I remember as a boy in elementary school, how often I used to make visits to that church when school was concluded at the end of the day. Partly, of course, to, delay going home to abuse, but mostly just because I loved being there in that big, beautiful space when no one else was there making music or noise, and I could just sit in the silence and connect with God and talk to God one-on-one and feel really connected. And assuming, back in those days, assuming that that custodian, Mr. Zilke, assuming that he wasn't cleaning in the church, in that time frame when school ended, I would also creep up the back stairs up to the choir loft and try to gain access just to get up there and snoop around and explore. Well, the door was almost always locked, so I didn't get in there very often. But one day, when I was in 5th grade, I found myself, by the grace of God, able to get inside the choir loft after school one day. And I found myself snooping around, and underneath the choir risers, which were built permanently into the floor, and I found all kinds of little carvings of people's initials and dates under there from students going way back, way back to before World War II. And so I thought, how cool is this? I need to carve my initials up in this in this secret place too. And so I'm hunting around looking for something to, carve my initials into one of the posts, so I can leave my initials and the date, for all time. I'm going to leave my mark there. And so here I am in the church, some 50 years later, in the church that I had loved since I was a toddler. And I actually have access to the choir loft again. What? I was so overjoyed. So I stepped inside and headed for that back row of risers, nearest the huge rose window of St. Cecilia playing the organ, even though I don't know why she's the patron saint of organists. She is an early Christian martyr, and organs weren't even invented for 1,000 years till after she had died. But anyway, she's the patron saint of organists. Well, that entire back wall where the rose window is located had been scrubbed clean and repainted, and the rose window itself now safely sealed up with glass storm windows. But I decided then to duck under the risers in the back and look for my own initials. I didn't know exactly where I'd put them, but eventually I got lucky. And I found my crudely carved initials, MH 32767. And I felt happy and nostalgic and remembering, just how naughty I felt at the time when I was doing this, defacing, the wood beam in the church. And I was happy and also a little, it was a bittersweet moment also. And like I said, there are quite a few other people's initials under those risers in that church. And it made me think of all of those other kids going back, who knows how long, probably the 1800s when the church was built, sneaking into the loft and carving their initials, finding a little adventure, maybe having a little sense of doing something naughty like I did, and leaving their initials and a date as kind of a permanent witness to their having passed through this church on their journey through this life. And then as I am touching with my hand, kind of tracing my initials and the date, it hit me. I did this on March 27th. March 27th is a significant date for me because I carved my initials in 1967. 20 years later to the day, I confessed my undying love to my boss, who was also a married man like me with young children. And he told me that he was in love with me too. And a crazy, intensely tragic love affair ensued that ended, of course, with both of us finally deciding that just because we were in love with someone else didn't make it okay. And that we both had bigger things to achieve in this life, bigger commitments, bigger responsibilities, and that the only right thing would be to end that relationship. That was 20 years to the day that I carved my initials up there in the choir loft. Well, fast forward another 10 years, March 27th, 1997, and again, it's a day of significance. It's the day that my firstborn son, Christopher, was killed in a car crash. And despite the challenges and the heartache of that period of time, I did find a way to move forward, and I did eventually find love and happiness and connection, and to the point where I am now, I think, living in the good old days of my life. But as I'm realizing that kind of prophetic nature of my carving the initials back in 1967, I'm like overwhelmed emotionally with such a deep sense of, the numinous, something I was just like, I had to sit down on the risers just to catch my breath in a place where countless other kids had for generations, long before I was even born, and some after I was born, had found their way up into that choir loft too when they weren't supposed to. And they carved their initials and the date that they were there, and probably smoked cigarettes and expressed their undying love for their boyfriends or girlfriends with initials inside a carved heart. There were a few of those. And maybe, if they were lucky, maybe they even found a way to bring that boyfriend or girlfriend up there and steal a kiss. Who knows? But it really hit me in a deep kind of way. Those are the things that make that church sacred. And every church. It's not just the stained glass windows and the historic organ console and the fancy candlesticks and the great gilded high altar and the marble side altars and all of that, donated in memory of people long gone. That's part of it, but that's not the whole story. Because under the rafters and in the basement corners and under the risers in the choir loft, there are also some things that imbue that sacred space with spiritual energy and power. Those are the evidences that people find sanctuary and safety and even a little glimpse of who they are later to become by being in that sacred space, by living in their Father's house, by simply being who they are. Proverbs 3:13 says, Happy are those who find wisdom and those who gain understanding. I assumed most of my life that by the time I got to be this age, I would have hella wisdom in my possession. I'm not sure that's true. I'm a work in progress. We all are. But some things I do know. I know the importance of having sacred spaces in our lives. I know the importance of looking for connections, looking for evidence of God's love for us. And unfortunately, when we get lost in nostalgia, as I did initially under the risers in the choir loft of St. Mary's Church, thinking about the good old days, they weren't all good. There's a lot of child abuse and nonsense going on there for me back in those good old days. And yet, there were some really good, powerful times. The thing about the good old days is this: we don't ever seem to live in those good old days in the present moment. And so maybe that is the piece of wisdom that I've come to at this point. Happy are those who find wisdom and who gain understanding. And maybe a piece of that wisdom is that if we so decide, today can be the good old days. Because it probably is. Really. So how might that change the way we walk through the world today if we believed and embraced this idea that today is the good old days, and I'm just going to do whatever I can with it. I'm going to dance my way through today, even if my heart is breaking. Simple thought. Let's pray. Mighty loving God, you have carried us through every day of our lives, showering us with blessings and insights, most of which we have frankly neglected to appreciate. Help us today, instead of being lost in the idea of the good old days being behind us, that today is the good old days. That your grace surrounds us, that your wisdom is always at the ready, trying to seep into our consciousness and into our hearts. Give us patience today, not only with the people we meet, but also with ourselves. And if we're feeling down or sad or limited in any way, help us to simply take a breath, to embrace the idea that today is an amazing miracle. Today is the good old days, because you love us, because you're not going to drop us on our butts, because everything is going to help us find our way to you. And for that, we thank you. Amen. Have a blessed Friday.